And hey everyone, welcome back to our ongoing coverage of Russian foreign policy. This is the second part of a two-part lecture that I have covering the ideological foundations of Russian foreign policy from 1991 to the present. And this is a big one, right? This is one that you want to get pen and paper, get your laptop ready, maybe pour yourself a drink or two, because we are looking now at the philosophy of sovereign democracy. Right? If there is an operational manual that Russia uses in its foreign policy, if there is a soft power that Russia has that makes it attractive, alluring to a number of countries, not just in the developing world, but also in the liberal parliamentary democratic world, it's this. So this is really a jumping off point from our previous discussion that focused first on the differences between Russia in the 1990s versus the 2000s afterwards, and the different leadership styles between Boris Yeltsin and Vladimir Putin. But what we are doing today is really looking at the formation of an ideology, if Russia has one, projecting outward through the former Soviet Union, Central and Eastern Europe, as well as the Middle East, Southern Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And, it is no coincidence then that I am beginning this lecture with a picture of a pro-Russia demonstration in Syria, where Russia and Vladimir Putin are very, very popular for a number of reasons, chief of which is Russia is instrumental in saving the Assad government in the Syrian civil war. And, forget, what you read in the papers about Assad being a brutal dictator, a tyrant. That's not for me to say. Certainly the evidence is there that his party and his regime is autocratic. But the ordinary Syrians in the streets that see Russia as a savior rather than a harbinger of doom has a lot to do with the sense that Russia saved Syria from becoming a dysfunctional, chaotic wasteland like Iraq or Libya or Afghanistan for that matter. And even though ordinary Syrians may have their opinions about Bashar al-Assad and the Ba'ath Party of Syria, the understanding is that the alternatives, whatever they might have been supported by the United States, the UK, NATO, the West, were exponentially worse than the current government that they have. So, this is going to be a lecture that will highlight, I think, the limits, the shortcomings of liberal democracy, and certainly some of the shortcomings of liberalism as an IR theory. So, as I've already hinted at, right, kind of place yourself within the confines of realism, but even more so the downloadable mods of constructivism. And, I think we can begin by looking at the general coverage that Russia, in particular Vladimir Putin, gets within the media. Now, just before I recorded this, I just went into Google and I typed Putin autocracy, Putin dictatorship, right? And this is what I get, right? You just get a plethora of articles. And these are all new. These are all recent. This is in the last couple of months here that would have you believe, right, that Russia under Vladimir Putin is this emerging dictatorship that, at one point is snuffing out liberties, freedoms, and democracies, but yet at the same time is marching itself into an early grave, right? And this is especially true in light of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where everyone is thinking that Putin has finally shot himself in the foot. That this is the beginning of the end, and I'm not going to get to Ukrainian specifics right now, but every time the Russian special forces take another town in eastern Ukraine, almost like clockwork, you can switch to the media and it's suddenly like, well, this is it. Russia's on the brink of collapse. Russia has isolated itself. They have no friends in the West. What is Putin's paranoia? He's really a small little man, obsessed with his own vaingloriousness. And, I think that this is once again a reminder of many in the West, unfortunately, reading Russia wrong. And here's what I'm hoping that we can uncover within this lecture. How, where, do we place Russia? What's its role in the 21st century? What is its role in an emerging multipolar system here? I've already hinted that we can look at Russia in some way as some type of introverted great power, right? So Russia sees itself as a global power, if not a regional power, within a multipolar world. That much is certain. But it sees itself as one that is sharing that stage along with a number of other countries, including the United States and China. Now, if we are to apply the realist model, right, and videos with Mearsheimer are abundant on YouTube these days, right, we note the importance of power, security, and influence, right? That much is certain. But there also is an additional element to that, and that is the reliance and the emphasis on power, security, and influence through an additional reliance on internationally accepted laws and precedents. Now, this is something that classic realism doesn't take into account, right? Good old-fashioned realism is like international institutionalism is at the absolute best, nothing more than the tool of a powerful state. In Russia's sense, at least when they're not, engaged in some kind of conflict, Putin, Lavrov are always talking about the sanctity of international law, the primacy of the United Nations, policies that are based on legal principles and existing UN resolutions. And here is where, Russia kind of wins the legal argument, especially in light of American unilateralism. So Russia's support for Serbia's territorial integrity against the unilateral independence of Kosovo is propped up by the argument that the last UN resolution to collectively categorize whatever Serbia was Security Council Resolution 1244, which was passed in 1999. And under the text of that identifies Kosovo as under international administration, but still part of Serbia, and by extension, Yugoslavia's territorial integrity. The same goes for Russia's position on Syria, Libya, Ukraine. We're going to get to all of this in this lecture in greater specifics. But it's the understanding that Russia is supporting these states by supporting what they see as the legitimate governments of said states. And this is especially true when it comes to Syria. Lesser extent on Libya and Ukraine, but the arguments do find their ways around, a number of whatabouts. We also need to place Russia's soft power within this emerging culture of national conservatism, and something that I'll be mentioning repeatedly in this lecture, an emphasis on the values of what I call the 3 Fs: faith, family, and fatherland. Right? It's a soft power diplomacy that advocates social conservatism and parochialism. And it is more than just simply a way of describing Russia's ideology that adheres to legal principles, because nobody gets excited over that, but a values-based approach to international affairs. And one that I need to say right now, one that works really well as a counterweight to the liberalist ideology of individual rights and identity politics. So in the same way that we can loosely argue in the United States that a conservative culture works when juxtaposed with the liberalist, neoliberal culture of individualism, the same thing happens here on the international stage, which is one of the reasons why some of Putin's biggest supporters around the world tend to come from conservative political movements and right-wing leaning leaders. And it's not just people like Donald Trump or, Jair Bolsonaro, but, Marine Le Pen, Viktor Orban, Alexander Vucic, Recep Erdogan, among others. And what makes this brand so popular? And again, I need to emphasize, put this into comparison against the principles of liberal internationalism, and you might find that this serves as an alternative ideology. So look, despite the constant barrage of Western media criticism of Russia, where Russia is this, Saturday morning cartoon villain that is preventing countries like Ukraine from reaching its democratic promised land, despite article after article of characterizing Putin as somebody who hates freedom, hates America, hates democracy around the world. One major inconvenient truth is that the man remains highly popular in Russian public opinion, right? I mean, just on average, his popularity rating since 2000 has fluctuated between 85 and 65%. Now, I don't think I need to remind you all about what the current approval rating of U.S. President Joe Biden happens to be, right? Which is just, it's tanking right now. But even among other Western democratic leaders, I mean, these approval ratings are in the stratosphere. I mean, the likes of which most democratic leaders would basically kill for. The highest approval rating recorded, by my knowledge, was 88% in October of 2014. So it's shortly around the time of Russia's annexation of Crimea. The lowest that he has ever had is 59%, which by American standards, if a U.S. president had a 59% approval rating, their re-election was assured. This was the lowest that he had in May 2020. Currently, right now, by statistics, his approval rating is at 83%, right? And that was recorded in June of 2022 here. And, look, visuals, I think, get the point across. His approval rating has never dipped below his disapproval. I mean, this looks like one heck of a Rorschach test right here, right? But the least popular he ever was before he even emerged as Russia's president, okay? But shortly afterwards, I mean, this is the 50% mark here, right? So this is by most recent standards, his approval rating in Russia is above 75%. And this is taken from Statista.com. Now, you can critique this by saying, well, can you conduct a real, true, honest public opinion poll in Russia, right? Let's say that you're, approached on the street with somebody with a clipboard, right? And you're saying, excuse me, what do you think of Vladimir Putin? Do you like him or not? Knowing that you are living in a state that's not as democratic as, the next Luxembourg or Austria, you might be hesitant to speak your mind. You might be, more willing to say, yeah, he's great, leave me alone, right? So you have to kind of factor, that in. But let's just say that, even during times of economic crises, and, we are talking here about 2008, 2009, 2020, how about immediately in the outbreak of the invasion of Ukraine, when the Russian ruble almost doubled it doubled in inflation. His approval rating still remained relatively high. And if he ever hit any snag, these things were quickly remedied by some other decision or some other sovereign decision-making. So, suffice to say, right, the man remains incredibly popular. And as I hinted in the previous lecture, his popularity among Russians 45 and older is almost guaranteed. Right? And this is one of the things that carries him. Through these high numbers. He's less popular among younger Russians, but if younger Russians don't vote, and if they feel like there's no point in voting because there is no workable opposition, well then status quo remains, right? I mean, that's kind of the thing here. And let's kind of return to some of these inconvenient truths about Russia, whether Western media likes to acknowledge them or not. Another big one is that before Russia became antagonistic with the West, it wanted to work with it in cooperative partnership. So before Russia is, or in specifically Putin, is viewed as public enemy number one against everything democratic and good, the man spent at least a decade reaching out to the West, specifically the United States, in some form of conciliatory gesture of mutual cooperation and development. And, a lot of the soft power that we will discuss about Russia today, kind of presenting itself as an alternative to Western liberalism, didn't begin under Putin, but really under Medvedev during that 4-year period where he served as Russia's president. The first 8 years of Putin's presidency, what we can call from 2000 to 2008, Putin was much more hesitant to declare what he wanted and where he envisioned Russia going. And most of the time, if someone asked him, he always visualized it in some partnership with the United States or even NATO, for that matter. It took a significant turn beginning in 2012 when Putin returned to the presidency under, some controversial situations. And then, of course, after 2014, after the Euromaidan movement in Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea, the onset of conflict in the Donbas region, Russia began to very begrudgingly accept that the West was not interested in working with Russia. And of course, now with the outbreak of a full invasion earlier this year, relations have never been, at their worst. Another inconvenient truth is that democracy does exist in Russia, right? I mean, I know that as far as, let's say, Freedom House is concerned, the media in the West, policymakers, no political rights, no civil liberties, no democracy, no political alternative, no opposition parties, no democracy. But this opens up another set of ideas, and one that I might do as a separate lecture, because we can get really metaphysical when it comes about this. But what is democracy? Right? What exactly is democracy? And as far as, let's say, Russia's political leaders are concerned, it's that if the grievances and the desires of the people are somehow met through representative government, then democracy exists. Maybe not in a liberal form, but certainly in a collective form. And, there have been times when Putin, Lavrov, among others, but these are the two big ones, have sort of alluded to the fact that democracy is in its infancy in Russia over the past 20 to 30 years. And if we were to put that timeline on the United States from, let's say the 1780s or so, Russia's doing a lot better than the U.S. was, right? It's still under this type of founding fathers managerial style that is focused on stabilization, right? So it's very reminiscent of other, what we call in the discipline, stabilitocracies. It's a nice little word that, warrants a definition. But, a stabilitocracy is a government that places law, order, and stability first over anything else, right? So it's the typical, what's more important, national security or civil liberties? And Russia has gone with the notion of national security first, civil liberties next. And this has been a work in progress over the past 20 to 25 years. And it's not just in Russia. Right? We find this in many of the Central Asian states, Middle East, Latin America. And even if we were to go back to the founding fathers, when does the United States truly become a liberal democracy? Almost 200 years later. One can say, the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 is when the country finally got around to acknowledging that certain people with various skin pigmentations were equally important in voting and representation, right? So in that sense, it's not that Russia is bereft of democracy, but it is a nascent developing democracy still under the managerial control of those in power. And that happens to be, right, someone like Vladimir Putin. And yes, look, is there opposition in Russia? There are. But these parties are electorally innocuous. Now, you could take this in one or two directions, right? You could say, well, the opposition doesn't exist in Russia because Putin doesn't allow it to happen. Or you could look in the other way and say, growing opposition parties in Russia have their core followers in key urban centers like Moscow and St. Petersburg. But Russia is vast. And, having urban opposition in these two cities might do something in terms of making local government competitive. But when we look at the rest of the country, most Russians, especially Russians 45 and older, are just going to inherently vote Putin. Or if he has to step down, like he did in 2008, they're going to vote for whoever it was that Putin supported, right? So Putin says to the electorate, I have to step down after 2 terms. This guy coming in, Dmitry Medvedev, is my guy, right? I'm Vladimir Putin, and I endorse this candidate. And people who didn't know who this guy was from Adam a few weeks ago were like, well, if Putin says he's good, I'm going to vote for him. And that's the reason why Medvedev's electoral victory was assured. But, you can read in Western media the presence of Russian opposition, right? And right now the key, opposition figure is a man by the name of Alexei Navalny, who is, I believe, now incarcerated, which, of course, is all of the bells and whistles needed among, media to show that opposition is harassed and jailed and dissenting thought is stifled. This cannot possibly be democratic. And, to an extent, they're not wrong, right? That's not, I'm not denying that. But the presence of an opposition in Russia, I think, exists more in Western minds and editorials than Russia. I think that we give people like Navalny or Nemtsov more credit and credibility among the Russian people than the Russian people themselves do. And there is another thing that we tend to forget, is that the curse of the Russian opposition figure is that the minute that they are proclaimed the champion of the opposition in the editorial pages of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, CNN, and others, they're stigmatized in their own country because they're now seen as some kind of puppet of the West, right? It's kind of a Juan Guaido movement, right, where people in Venezuela may not like Nicolas Maduro, and there's not much to like about the guy. But when the opposition figure is now backed by and financed by, fifth column movements in the U.S., well, then the opposition figure goes from being an opponent to simply being a Manchurian candidate. Right? He goes from just being a political alternative to being a tool, a puppet of the outside. And so I think it's within this context that we need to understand the importance of Russian soft power. It's one that really began under Medvedev, but became a marketing brand once Putin returns to the presidency in 2012. And it's a brand of leadership and governance as really by now, 10 years later, a growing viable alternative to liberal democratic principles, which is why in many Western liberal media outlets, conservative opponents, national populist opponents are usually deemed people that are, pro-Putin, they're anti-liberal, and they're going to do to, country X what Putin has done to Russia, what Orban has done to Hungary, what Erdogan has done to Turkey. So, this brand is certainly seen as an alternative to liberal democratic principles when focused on economic neoliberalism and, of course, liberal identity politics. It's a very simple way of juxtaposing, on one side, democracy as the collective rights of the group versus democracy as the individual rights of the citizen. And once identity politics becomes more important to talk about than healthcare, than the environment, than the economy, and other elements like that, then all of a sudden this brand becomes the only alternative to the identity politics that are part of, liberal urban elite outlooks. Okay, so why then, right? Why Russia? Why does this work? And why are these inconvenient truths there? I've already hinted in the previous lecture that more than simply rectifying the problems of the 1990s, Vladimir Putin, whether we like it or not, for good or for ill, has offered a model of stability and leadership for a country based on principles, values, ideals, and behaviors that are, and I'm air quoting this, but you can see it, Russian and not Western. Now, this is critically important to note here. So I want to just make this note here, just in case you're all kind of drifting off here wondering, right? This type of soft power is rooted in, at least as far as Putin and Lavrov are concerned, European values, but not liberal European, right? There's conservative European, there's traditional European, there's parochial European, but not the liberal European or Eurostructural models that define the European Union, or the type of EU-led globalization that places economic principles, international economic principles, over the sovereign decision-making of individual states. So this is important because Russia's soft power is kind of like a states' rights narrative, right? A national conservative, a national sovereign decision-making principle. They're not against the market. They're not against globalization. But they're against the understanding that the IMF, the World Bank, the major corporations, the EU central bank, the US, whatever it is, can run roughshod over the decisions, the interests, the values, and the objectives of smaller countries. And so as far as Russia is concerned, right, Russia's not taking this on as a global crusade. But what they're doing is showing how this can work for Russia. And in this case, the political leadership have placed a reassertion of Russian power and authority within the lens of multipolarism, instead of labeling it as anti-American or anti-democracy. So in much the way in which American, British, German, and Canadian press will mislabel this as just simply a return to dictatorship, a return of communism, or Soviet Union 2.0. Russia's political leadership has been very clear in saying that this new counter-alternative ideology will be firmly rooted within the multipolar power alignment of states, in which case other countries can and should take part in this. Russia is coming up with ideas and principles that are good for Russia's sovereign decision-making. China should do the same thing for China. Turkey should do the same thing for Turkey. Iran should do the same thing for Iran. And yes, we get it. America should do the same thing for America. But there's not one country that can then use their values as a way of superseding everyone else's. Okay? So this is a type of fusion of global internationalism with a conservative philosophy that, and I was thinking about this as I was putting this stuff together, is very reminiscent of one of the thoughts of Barry Goldwater. Now, this is not Putin or Lavrov, or no one is quoting Goldwater, but I remember this this quote by Goldwater, in which conservatism, the conservative philosophy, is to apply the wisdom and experience and the revealed truths of the past to the problems of today. Right? So this is a very paleoconservative outlook. This is not theocratic. This is not evangelical. There's none of that kind of stuff, right? It's just that in order to find solutions to problems of the present, we don't need to reinvent the wheel the entire time. We can look to elements of the past traditions, past practices, to see if they can be replicable. And if they can, well, then the past is important because it is something that is rooted in our history, in our tradition, and in our culture. And more than just that, says Goldwater, but this fits rather nicely with Russian soft power, man is not just an economic creature, but a spiritual creature as well. Now, here is where things get interesting, because the neoliberal global order is all about the market, right? If there's any kind of spirituality, it is in consumerism. Right? Holidays are remembered not by what we do with family, friends, or the church or houses of worship, but by how much on sale it is at Best Buy. And whether this is something that is truly believed or whether this is just a great way of countering it, right? Russian soft power is that people are spiritual creatures as well. We are driven not just by market interests, but also by a sense of what's our purpose in life. What do we owe our families? What do we owe our children? What do we owe our country? Hence the whole faith, family, and fatherland narrative. And so in this concept, let's revisit this question about Russia and democracy. Is Russia a democratic state? As far as structure is concerned, it has some of the rudimentary features, right? It has, a legislature, a judiciary, it has an executive branch. This is the stuff of comparative politics, not here. But from a cultural point of view, from a practical point of view, among ordinary Russian citizens, right, there is a belief in democratic principles, but there is little faith in liberal democratic institutions. And this is especially true, again, among the 45-year-olders and up, who remember the electoral chaos of the 1990s, where Russia had, how today there's no opposition parties in Russia. Russia in the 90s had dozens of opposition parties, right? Many of them getting, a little bit more than 3, 4, 5% of the vote, which of course dilutes any kind of legislative consensus and also precludes this understanding that parties that get elected are inherently democratic. Many of them are not. Many of them are openly autocratic. So, it's kind of be careful who or what you wish for, because you might actually end up, voting in autocratic, non-democratic powers. How did Hitler come to power? That's one of the arguments that many make, not just in Russia, but elsewhere. So among the Russian population, again, the 40-year-olds and up, there is a greater support for traditional forms of authority, right? The president, the church, even the military, but not political, because there is this, this understanding that politicians are greedy, they're corrupt, they can be bought off, especially in the regional areas away from Moscow or St. Petersburg, right? They're basically just, fat cats that feed off of the public tax dollars. So there is this support for democratic growth, but without international demands and stipulations. So whenever the United States or some NGO or Freedom House or the International Crisis Group or something like that, some think tank, decides to write a prescription for some fledgling democracy on what they need to do, it sounds great among those policy-making circles, right? We can make ourselves feel good that we're smart and intelligent. But for the people at the receiving end, this is almost always understood as some kind of dismissive conclusion that the people in question are unable to do it on their own, right? And that democracy or liberalism or freedoms need to be introduced to these poor people who have never had it before. They know nothing about it. If we can't force regime change anytime soon, we can inculcate civil society to get them to think differently. And, for many Russians and people within the region, this is seen as foreign incursions, which oftentimes produced colored revolutions, right? Colored revolutions, which are in the West always seen as, the next attempt at trying to dislodge authoritarian leadership. But to many on the receiving end, all that it really does is get rid of one group of dysfunctional, corrupt tin pot dictators and replace them with another. And the only difference is that the new leadership looks to the West for handouts, as opposed to Moscow. Colored revolutions oftentimes bring instability. They disrupt the internal sovereign decision-making of countries. And they don't ever produce a new government or a new leadership that is really any better. And eventually, the public just becomes disillusioned with democracy, with politics altogether, because they realize that these colored revolutions don't make the country better. They just simply change they just change the people at the top. We're just changing the letterhead. We're not changing or fixing the bureaucracy. And so, within the political science discipline, there is a, significant body of work done that looks at the connection between something that starts out as a colored revolution, but ends in a rotten transition. And folks, let me tell you something. Nothing dislodges, disrupts, derails democratic development worse than rotten transitions. Because a country can, create the illusion of electoral democracy. And they can have, one or two little token opposition parties. And, as long as the president, prime minister, whoever it is, waves the EU flag or takes a selfie with Hillary Clinton or John McCain back in the day, they can basically do whatever they want internally, right? The United States is notorious for supporting, propping up a number of hybrid regimes that we will do a horrible job convincing our audience that they are paragons of democracy, when most people inside the country know that they are nothing more than corrupt, authoritarian, dysfunctional regimes. I'm looking at you, Ukraine. This is sort of the bad thing about it. And just because the current Ukrainian leadership is pro-Western, pro-American, pro-democratic, it doesn't make them any better than they were under the previous government of Viktor Yanukovych. This is my long-winded then tie-in to sovereign democracy, right? Sovereign democracy, if Russian foreign policy has a soft power, if Russia itself has a brand that it is now projecting out into the world, it is a term that is really a way of describing Russia's homegrown political, economic, and cultural path towards collective democracy and sovereignty, right? And in this sense, sovereignty is more important than democracy. A country that is not sovereign, does not have the ability to make its own decisions, is one that will never be democratic. So to become sovereign, Russia needs to be economically competitive. Okay, but to become economically competitive, it must be governed democratically. All right? We're reverse engineering this. To become democratic, Russia must reflect the traditions of Russian history and the values of the Russian people. Now, this is where, once again, it's very difficult to not do this. This is where IR bumps into comparative politics. And, I have said for years, you want to do good political science, you have to do good history. You have to dabble in sociology. You gotta look at political psychology. You gotta look at political culture. Because if you don't do that, you're going to be reading Russia, China, India, Turkey, Afghanistan, Serbia, Syria, the US wrong. You're going to be scratching your heads wondering what's the matter with Kansas, when in fact there is nothing wrong with Kansas, to coin the title of the book by Thomas Frank, but that people choose political options rationally, right? Nobody votes stupidly. So why, therefore, do people choose the leaders, choose the policies, choose the parties that they do? In Russia's case, the decision is to opt for one's own traditions, values, history, and culture, rather than something that is imported from the outside. And, that's why sovereign democracy can't be attributed to any one person in Russia. If anything, we can begin with the writings of former Chief of Staff Vladislav Surkov. It was him that coined the term, though it has a collective narrative that has been kind of wikied, shared, edited, tweaked, here and there by people like former Prime Minister Yevgeny Primakov, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, and of course, Putin himself. If I was to come up with a textbook definition of sovereign democracy, we'll take directly from Surkov's writings. It is a society's political life where the political powers, their authorities, and decisions are decided and controlled by a diverse Russian nation for the purpose of reaching material welfare, freedom, and fairness by all citizens, social groups, and nationalities, by people that formed it. Now, it seems pretty, straightforward. Nothing inherently wrong with that. It is, in a way, a gauntlet being thrown down that says sovereign democracy is Russia's road to democracy, but it's also its way of reconstructing itself. Right? So there's a couple of other things that need to go into our understanding of what sovereign democracy is. Putin has gone on record multiple times in saying that the biggest calamity that hit the Russian people in the 20th century, besides the Second World War, was the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And that was because Russia as a country and Russians as people were not ready for it, right? They were not ready for the democracy that was expected of them to be exhibited when the Soviet Union fell and then spiraled into chaos and decay. Now, this is an indirect way of pointing the finger at economic shock therapy and saying the internationally prescribed policies that were given to Yeltsin, among others, to do in the name of this is how you're going to be a democracy were incompatible with Russia, right? Incompatible with a people that had not known this type of government, this type of leadership. And we're coming off of 75 years of Soviet rule. So it's not that democracy is alien to Russia, but that it's kind of like the equivalent of this, right? How many of you still have these dreams where you find yourself suddenly back in school, whether it's high school or middle school, and in your dream, you're in some class and you're freaking out because in your dream, maybe this is only me, I don't know, but you're freaking out that you haven't been to this class in weeks, right? In the dream, you know that you've missed so many classes, but there's an exam that you have to take, right? Or there's some project that's due. And you're thinking to yourself, oh my God, I don't know. I didn't study. I didn't read. I didn't pay attention. Why am I here? And then you wake up and you are, beyond happy that you're in your 30s and this is all over. Well, it's kind of like this, is that the Western world, the international financial world was looking at Russia in the 90s and saying, well, figure out how to do it on your own. And, we'll give you a few loans and this and that, but, we expect you to become fully democratic by like 95, 96. And it's like, well, the sad reality is that countries don't become fully consolidated democratic states for at least 20, 30, maybe even 40 years. Right? It takes a long time for these things to manifest. So into the fray, into the chaos, as I've mentioned in the previous lecture, comes people like Putin, who makes the acknowledgement that the state must restore its sovereignty first and then build democracy second. So in other words, democracy is the software. The sovereignty is the hardware. We have to consolidate and strengthen state institutions first, and then we can talk about voting, political opposition, and other elements like that. So before we can talk about democracy and opposition parties and debates and this, that, the other thing, we need to reconstruct the middle class that was devastated throughout the 90s. We need to revamp a Russian bureaucracy that was just limping along from the old Soviet period. We need to modernize and effectively improve our military. And of course, we need a strong economy. So think of it also like this. You're building a house. You're still deciding how the blueprints are going to look. Is it going to be one level or two levels? Is it going to have a, two-car garage? One car, no car garage. There's no point in arguing over whether we want drapes or blinds before we decide where the windows go, right? There's no point in fighting over whether we go to IKEA or Raymore and Flanagan before we decide how big the living room is going to be or where the electrical outlets are going to go, right? So you got to get the skeletal framework of the state down first. Then you can spice it up with all the little trappings and intricate features that are democratic. And so within this period of structural stabilization, the United Russia Party, surprise, surprise, the party of Putin, should govern for, 15, 20 years, however long that it happens to be, in the name of state-led stabilization and development, right? And the goal here is not to consolidate power like an autocracy, but that the party has a legal, but more importantly, a moral responsibility to stabilize the state, to root the state's foundational identities, its values, its beliefs, its morals, its principles within constitutional law, right? We can't tell people to go to the polls and vote when people could still vote for any Tom, Dick, and Harry ideology. Another way of looking at it is that in a consolidated democracy, right, you have the privilege of choice but almost all political parties work within some legal, constitutional, democratic framework. In a state that is consolidating and growing now, and this is, Putin will point to Central Asia as an example of this, which is the reason why a lot of the former Central Asian stand countries have been under the tight control of one top-heavy executive leader, is that if the people go to the polls and vote before there is a standardization of what is important, people can effectively vote for extremist movements, whether they are Islamic movements, parochial movements, whatever they happen to be, and it upsets the balance of the state before, the government is even consolidated. So what do we do in order, what constitutes the skeletal framework of the state? What constitutes the pillars of stability? Law and order, education, social discipline, financial independence, and, look, let's be honest, most of these are conservatives, traditional authority. It doesn't mean that they are anti-progressive, but what it means is that we look to our past as a way of charting a path and a roadmap for the future, right? And this is something that resonates within studies of political culture, right? The past is always important. And if you think that this is somehow archaic to the West, I mean, the United States is, I think, more in love with its past than it is with its present or future. And, this isn't even a Republican thing. Even Democrats will kind of, almost as like a knee-jerk oral tick, will say, well, the Founding Fathers said this, or that's not what the Founding Fathers wanted. It's almost as if, like, in order to get your point across, to legitimize it, it's like, will this make Thomas Jefferson smile or cry? And it's like, who cares about Thomas Jefferson? But that's the whole point, is that the past is where our present and future are rooted. Now, let's apply this to globalization, because Russia acknowledges the realities of globalization today, right? This has been happening since the mid-1990s, right? The world will not recede back into 193 hermetically sealed countries with their own currencies and laws. Transnational globalization, international capitalism is going to be, it is a fact of life. But it's a fact of life that emphasizes the need for states to possess sovereign decision-making, lest they be colonies of others. Now, Putin had given reference to this recently, about a couple of weeks ago, at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, where he talks about, in today's world, there are two types of states: sovereign states or colonies. And it's a very realistic way of looking at the world, right? Globalization is the way in which the anarchic international arena is. And yes, it can be left to its own devices, a type of law of predatory capitalism. So therefore, states need to safeguard themselves against the waves of global capitalism. And the best way to do this is to have robust state institutions. The very same thing that shock therapy was telling Russia and other states to dismantle. Right? Putin's coming back saying, no. See, this is what got us into trouble in the first place. State institutions, strong, stable state economies, that's the important thing, right? It's not that the Russian automobile industry is better than the German, the Japanese, or the American, but that the Russian automobile industry exists in the first place, left to its own devices. And this is what we see in a good chunk of Eastern Europe in the 90s and the early 2000s. Every country had their own car company, right? Serbia, Yugoslavia had the Yugo. Romania had the Dacia. The Czechoslovakia had the Škoda. And unfettered global capitalism leads to all of them going out of business and being bought out by Renault, by Volkswagen, by Fiat, by Mercedes, by BMW, whatever it happens to be. And for the customer, well, hey, I don't want to drive a Yugo. I want to drive a BMW. Cool. But the thing is that what makes Mercedes or BMW or Honda or Toyota or Ford somehow comparatively better? Are the cars better? Well, when you compare a Mercedes to a Škoda, of course. But Mercedes didn't get to where it was just by luck alone. But it relied on, and still relies on strong state institutions keeping it active. The same thing for the American car industries, as well as the Japanese, right? Hondas and Toyotas. So what Russia is saying is that the Lada can and should eventually be just as lucrative, just as good. And yeah, I mean, it's fun to drive as a traditional thing, and if you're big on nostalgia, sure, why not? But this is the example of a sovereign state, one that does not allow its own industries to be bought out by transnational global corporations, because if you are, you're a colony instead. Another thing about sovereign democracy and globalization is that it provides a filter for, or if necessary, a barrier against unwanted foreign elements. So moving away from, let's say, the predatory global capitalism, it's also a way of blunting, stymieing, and keeping out unwanted fifth column NGOs, colored revolutions. These are things that are seen as Western soft power, that are not needed. In fact, they're nothing more than instigators of instability, right? If you can already get a sense of what sovereign democracy is, it's this primacy of stabilization, which by its antithesis, what is something that sovereign democracy fears? Chaos, disorder, disharmony, right? Putin hates that stuff. He hates American-led regime change. Not because he has a vested interest in Saddam Hussein or Muammar Gaddafi, or I don't think he has any personal feelings of friendship with Bashar al-Assad, but that regime change doesn't do anything good. We still have this belief that, we go into Iraq, we go into Ukraine, we did it in Germany, we in 45, we can do it now. But that's not the case anymore, right? We don't do regime change all that well. We make the country even worse. So as far as Russia's concerned, this is an element of chaos. This is something that seeps from one failed country into another within the region. And it doesn't produce any stabilization or growth, but it actually leads to political extremism, political and economic decay, and of course, moral degeneration. And speaking of that last part, right, it is a way of upholding what we refer to as the non-negotiable truths, the values, the beliefs, and practices of each cultural civilization. So as I hinted in the previous lecture, somebody high up in the Kremlin must have gotten their hands on Sam Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, read it, and took it to heart. Because the understanding that Russia is its own unique civilization, with its own values and history and ideals, means that it can and should resist the encroachments of whatever Western-led, consumer-driven civilization that there is, right? So when we heard a couple of months ago that McDonald's was pulling out of Russia, right, in light of the war in Ukraine, right? Western media was all, having a field day. Like, ha ha, look at Russia, and no one they don't want you. Big Mac don't want you. McDonald's doesn't want you. Most Russians are like, I don't care. Who cares about McDonald's? Screw McDonald's. Our food is better. There's not a single McDonald's in Uzbekistan when I was there. There's not a single McDonald's in Tashkent. And to be perfectly honest, the food is better. You don't need it. So as far as I'm concerned, I wasn't lamenting. I don't go to McDonald's when I'm here. I think there was 1 or 2 KFCs and I think 1 little token Wendy's, but that was about it. But other than that, it's like, oh no, we're not getting your crappy fast food. Oh well, that kind of stuff. So, this understanding that civilizations are real, but they don't necessarily have to clash if they find sovereign ways to cooperate. So this is why we see Russia cooperating quite well with non-Western, with non-Russian civilizations like China, or Iran, or Turkey, or India, or Brazil, or South Africa. You look at Brics, for instance. Like, what's the thing that holds them all together? Certainly not any cultural threads. You could say, well, Brics is just anti-Western, anti-American. There's nothing stopping India, China, Brazil from working with the United States, with the UK, with France or Germany. There's nothing stopping them at all. It doesn't mean that you work in Brics or anti-Western, but it just simply shows that civilizations today don't have to worry about working with the United States and then being like, okay, in return for this, economic agreement, you all have to have a couple of gay pride parades every, few months of the year or whatever it is, right? Unless you're China or Saudi Arabia, we don't really care about that. But, if you're a developing country in the Baltics, you got to do that. The whole idea of civilizations cooperating is that, look, you want to have one, but have one because you feel that you need to have one, not because the U.S. says you have to have one, or because Germany says you need to have one in order to get into the European Union. So there is a cultural element to sovereign democracy more than just simply something focusing on stability. And, it's worth then looking at, the 5 principles. These are the 5 principles laid out by Dmitry Medvedev as what sovereign democracy upholds. The first is the primacy of the basic principles of international law and the defense of any state sovereignty that is violated against international law. So the United Nations is the pinnacle of international legal precedent. It is not a world government. Sovereign democracy does not want to make it a world government. But if the UN has a clear delineation over the territorial integrity of states and how they should not be interfered from the outside, then Russia is going to adhere to that principle. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, okay, explain Ukraine, right? Explain Ukraine. I'll get to that when we get to the section on Ukraine, but spoiler alert, Russia's excuse is, well, Ukraine was already being screwed with from the United States and NATO, so they're already being intervened. Our intervention is like a counter-intervention, right? Our intervention in Ukraine is to actually save it from itself. I'll let you decide whether that, whether that passes the litmus test or not. The second principle is the acceptance of a multipolar international system. I've been repeating this already enough times for you to make it very difficult to forget. But the understanding is that in this day and age, especially if we're going to adhere to the realities of globalization, the pursuit of unipolarity by any state is untenable. American, Russian, Chinese, it's just not going to happen. In this day and age, global unipolarism cannot happen anymore, simply because there are way too many states that are powerful enough to resist one in particular. American unipolarism, Russia argues, was able to be what it was in the 1990s because A, Russia was basically falling in on itself, B, China had not yet emerged as a full economic power, and C, the other major world economic powers like Germany or Japan or South Korea were all part of an American-led economic system. So they were able to do this simply by the idea that there was no other power that could do that. In this day and age, Russia argues, that is no longer the case. So Russia's not looking to be a unipolar power, and neither is China for that matter. And the sooner the United States realizes that this is the reality that we're in, the sooner we will actually be able to address new global challenges with a cooperative framework. Third principle of sovereign democracy, Russia will not start a confrontation with any country, but it will not also isolate itself, nor will it stand down to confrontation by another state. In other words, Russia is not going to pick a fight with any country. However, if a country picks a fight with them, they're not going to just simply roll over and ignore it. And this is mostly applied to NATO's expansion and intervention, right? Russia was in no position to counter NATO's first expansion in '99. They were already exhibiting grumblings and opposition with NATO's second expansion in '04. But by the time we get to '09 through the present period, and even though Russia wasn't able to prevent any of these other countries from joining, they are now finally drawing a line in the metaphoric sand and saying, not Ukraine, not Georgia, right? It's one thing if little itty-bitty Montenegro joins, who cares? But when it comes to the areas of the former Soviet Union, okay, this is where principles 4 and 5 come in. Principle 4, Russia's priority is to protect the life and dignity of Russian citizens, wherever they are. So the fact that there are Russians living in Ukraine and the demographic percentage is always up for debate because it depends really on what you're looking for. If we're talking about people who speak Russian as their primary language and not Ukrainian, up until 2014, the population of Ukraine was overwhelmingly Russian. With the exception of Lviv, every other major Ukrainian city was a Russian-speaking majority. But does that necessarily make them Russian, or is that just the language that they use? Russia keeps this fuzzy, but the idea is that there are clearly people in Ukraine that not only speak Russian, but identify as Russian, right? Crimea being the main example. There are Russians in Kazakhstan, in Belarus, in Uzbekistan, and elsewhere. And so Russia's main goal is to protect the life and dignity of every single person that identifies as Russian. And to point 5, Russia will engage in regions with which it has traditionally enjoyed historical, privileged, and cordial relations. Hence, the territory of the former Soviet Union. So when you have NATO now encroaching on Ukraine, or Georgia, or Moldova, this is now the red flag as far as Russia is concerned. Less so Croatia, Albania, Montenegro, Macedonia. Of course, we can bring up the additional argument of whether NATO should exist at all, but right now, as far as NATO's leadership, you better believe that they need to exist. Okay? So this, with all of that said, leads us to ask, is sovereign democracy a type of soft power? Is this a way in which Russia can exhibit some form of cultural diplomacy, not just to its immediate neighbors, but to other countries around the world, including that of Europe? There certainly is an internal consumption of sovereign democracy. It is a soft power from the state to its own citizens, in the sense that A, it shows that the country, the leadership, is cleaning up the mess from the 1990s, and B, that there is some kind of promoted lifestyle choices that one can opt for against the specter of moral decay and decadence from the West. So if you're against this kind of stuff, this consumer-driven, neoliberal, identity politics-driven stuff, especially if you're not living in like the center of, urban cities, this narrative is something that you can look to. Of course, there's also external consumption for other like-minded countries. And, as I mentioned in the beginning of this lecture, Russia will sort of see itself as the constant defender of national sovereign interests. And, it serves, in a way, as a role model for the type of leadership by Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, Serbian President Alexander Vučić, France's National Front Party leader Marine Le Pen, Justice and Development Party head and Turkish President Recep Erdogan, Chinese Party Secretary Xi Jinping, Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro, Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte, Syria's Bashar al-Assad, Egypt's Gamal Fattah al-Sisi, Donald Trump, of course, former Italian President Silvio Berlusconi, and, of course, India's current Prime Minister Narendra Modi. These are all leaders that, in some way, shape, or form, espouse their positions, their top-heavy executive decision-making leadership on the principles of stabilitocracy, right? Order, stability, direction, as a way of preventing the country from internal fragmentation against the so-called colored revolutions that seem to constantly be coming out of Western NGO circles. Now, mind you, this has certainly met with a significant degree of criticism in the media, not just American and British, but even among some of the media outlets within the countries that these leaders are associated with, right? And whether it's Putin or Erdogan or Orban or others, there's a sense of Godfather-style leadership that these individuals have. Top-heavy executive, paternalistic style of leadership that does not really give any quarter to the separation of powers. They don't defer to the legislature. They oftentimes embody that Louis XIV notion, l'état c'est moi, I am the state. This is naturally seen as a threat to liberal democracy, which, has its own set of elites and oligarchs, however way you want to look at them, right? There's a general disdain for the ordinary person's viewpoints making its way all the way up to the upper echelons of power being represented. It was one of you that asked in the previous lecture, what is the relationship between Brexit and national populism, and how does that fit into sovereign democracy? It fits perfectly in the sense that Brexit was looked at among adherents of sovereign democracy as the country taking its sovereignty back, right? Brexit was, if nothing else, a way of telling unelected, unaccountable Eurocrats in Brussels, you don't make economic decisions for the UK anymore. We're going to do that. Now, whether that was successful or not, or whether Brexit is going to make the UK better, that's up for question. But this understanding that sovereign democracy is criticized in Western liberal media means that it's a rejection of the status quo. It's a rejection of the type of philosopher king, intellectual-led, consultant type of leadership that has often now just been assumed as the pinnacle of democratic development, right? So it's an alternative type of democracy, an illiberal version of democracy. And of course, along with this sense of soft power, particular to Russia, are a couple of things that I need to mention. First is this concept of Neo-byzantinism, right? Is sort of this adherence to democracy within sort of not non-Western, but clearly Eastern European, Orthodoxy, Byzantine, Imperial, Roman format here. So it's an adherence to democracy as the collective rights of the group over the individual rights of the citizen, right? And this is kind of what we will, many will see as illiberal democracy within critical circles. But it places the uniqueness of orthodoxy, Orthodox Christianity, as a European variant. So in this sense, it's not anti-Western. It's not anti-European because Orthodoxy is part of Europe's civilizational history, right? It's part of the Byzantine heritage, which is just as much European history as the Holy Roman Empire, as Charlemagne, as Napoleon, among others. So there's links between Rome and even the Enlightenment, especially if we talk about Imperial Russia, right? Imperial Russia, particularly under Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, right? They were big champions. They were big patrons of development, of the Renaissance, of the scientific and industrial revolutions. When it comes to Catherine the Great, one of her biggest, pen pal fans was Voltaire. So the Enlightenment is not disconnected from Russia's Neo-Byzantine heritage, but it can be seen as an alternative to the liberal values that Western heritage provides. And this is, as I've already said, consumerism, materialism, and of course, identity politics. Now here is where the criticism comes the most vocal, because this is seen as Russia's attempt at being anti-LGBTQ, at being anti-feminist, at being anti-individual, and sort of laying out the roles and the duties that people need to have in order to form a family. Now, look, let's be perfectly honest here. Russia is suffering from a major demographic decline. No one's having kids anymore. Hence the notion that Russia needs to repopulate. Now, it's not like the country is going to go extinct in a generation, but the population, like many countries in Europe, are on a gradual decline. And so this adherence to faith, family, and fatherland, the family part, is important. But that also then designates the important roles of a father and a mother. So it is a very heterogeneous, it is a very heteronormative family style, family values, effectively, is what Neo-Byzantinism is. Now, what about the role of the church? There is a separation of church and state, very similar to that in the West, right? Like the United States, France, and others. But the separation has different connotations because the church has special roles and responsibilities that they still need to perform. The state has certain tasks and objectives. The church does its own. The church does not interfere into the day-to-day political dealings of the state. But at the same time, the state acknowledges that the church plays the moral card, right? The church provides that normative sense of lifestyle. So the state has its role to play, the church has its, and this is effectively taken from the structure of government of Byzantium, right? There is this, what we call the Symphonia between emperor and patriarch. Both have roles to play, both have responsibilities, neither interfere in the affairs of others. Now, this specific thing doesn't really have a lot of resonance outside of other Orthodox heavy countries. So it's going to find adherents among conservative groups in Serbia, Ukraine, Belarus, Bulgaria, Montenegro, definitely the Slavic-speaking countries. Even among the non-Slavic, Greece and Armenia, there are certain conservative, traditional, parochial values that many can find resonance, especially with, right, this idea that the more you want to adhere to principles of orthodoxy, you're inherently anti-liberal. Right? Now, the Orthodox Church isn't inherently anti-liberal, but in this day and age, especially when liberal Western democratic values are all about the atomization of society, the church steps in and says, well, this is just an aberration, right? This is wrong, right, in many ways. So it's going to find support. It's going to find fans among the more, structurally conservative and socially conservative groups within these countries, but in a way, even within some Central European and even Western European countries, right? And look, Putin has made it an important part of his, tenure in power to maintain good relations with the Russian Orthodox Church. And the individual here in the picture is the current patriarch, Kirill I. Kirill is effectively, in a way, a parallel with Putin. The two sometimes see eye to eye. Sometimes the patriarch, sometimes the church criticizes Putin's leadership, especially if the decision is made that runs counter to social norms, to traditional values. The church was actually the church was in opposition to Russia going to war with Georgia in 2008. The church is a bit more in a controversial position now in the sense that they support the war in Ukraine, but they support it as a way of countering what they believe as Western values that have infiltrated the Ukrainian mindset, and none of them are good. So it's a sense of moral decadence, adherence to all kinds of vices and other elements. So the church is certainly condemning the loss of life, especially when it is really a civil war between two Orthodox churches. But the church has given its approval to Putin for the intervention in the name of replacing the Western values of Ukraine, the decadent demoralization values it believes, with things that are more proper, right, in that matter. And I think a good way of looking at this, and I'm taking this figure from one of the assigned readings this week. This is from Domenico Valenza's article, Russia's Cultural Diplomacy in the Post-Soviet Space. And we can kind of see here, right, the way in which the soft power, at least in terms of social conservatism, is differentiated, right? In the Russian world, family-oriented, whereas the West espouses the role of the individual. History, art, music, and everything emphasizes the classical, right? The classics are always good. In the West, anti-conformist. Family values are centered on heterosexual principles. The West, apparently only gays, right? The West is trying to make everybody gay, apparently. As far as history, the Russian world remembers its history, upholds its history, defends its monuments, re-erects monuments that have been defaced and destroyed. Whereas in the West, history is falsified. Everything is relative. Everything is postmodern. Everything is basically designed by Hollywood. And then, of course, is the role of religion, right? Russia is obviously religious, and the West is, of course, inherently godless. A lot of these are extreme. A lot of these certainly ignore the fact that, how religious are people in Russia today? How many of them go to church every Sunday? It's a small group here. And look, not everybody in the West is the Czech Republic, okay? But the notion here is, at this point, post-2014, the sovereign democracy that Russia is projecting to the world is a counter. It's an alternative. It's at best a variation, at worst a complete departure from the decadence, the immorality, the decay of family life, the disrespect for history, for elders, for tradition that one apparently finds in the West. Now, a second major element of sovereign democracy's soft power is the nostalgia and the memory of the Soviet Union. Now, this has a number of key parts to it. And, like the Neo-Byzantine model, it's not global in outlook, right? It's got a focus on specific countries and peoples, right? So in the same way that the Neo-Byzantine model unifies countries along Orthodox Christianity, Soviet nostalgia is a way of trying to keep together, right, many, if not all, of the emerging former countries of the Soviet Union, right, minus the Baltics, which kind of have gone their own way. But, the shared memories of victory over Nazism, the defeats of fascism in the Second World War, the accomplishments that the Soviet Union went on to experience in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, right? All of these shared memories, these struggles, the shared products, the shared ideals are things that Russia is trying to show and remind, right? Countries like Belarus and Armenia and Georgia and the Central Asian stands and, even Ukraine, right? That they have a common history. They have a common experience in the 20th century. And this is not something that ordinary people dismiss. I mean, again, I'm using my example when I was living in Uzbekistan, and I also spent some time in Tajikistan as well. There is this sense, right? There's this sense among people who live there that whenever they come across some other person that comes from the former Soviet Union, doesn't matter where it is, right? There's a sense of brotherhood. There's a sense of okay, you're closer to me than somebody from Paraguay, or Portugal or something like that, right? So an Uzbek will, meet an Armenian, and they have nothing in common as far as language or religion, but they do most likely speak Russian. And then a Tajik comes in, a Kyrgyz walks in, a Belarus walks in, and you know what? At the end of the day, Ukrainian is probably hesitating as to whether they want to join this, little happy table of drinking. But they're why not? These guys aren't all that bad. And suddenly, there is this shared sense of what their parents experienced, what their grandparents experienced. And, this is something that Putin has been known to promote, right? Especially when it comes to official state commemorations, like Victory Day, every May 9th. This is like Russia's Memorial Day, Veterans Day, Independence Day, all wrapped up, into one, right? The big parade in Red Square, where Shoigu is being driven by this, open-air chauffeur car, and he greets the fellow soldiers, Здравствуйте, товарищи, and they respond back and, wishes them a happy Victory Day, and then you get 10,000 soldiers going, Ura, and everything else like that, right? This is not a way to bring back the Soviet Union, but it's a way to remind people that your post-Soviet history is still connected to this. The Soviet Union is your history. The anti-fascist struggle is your history. And this is being played out again today in Ukraine, which explains why, Russian media is pretty much quick to portray every enemy in Ukraine as some Nazi, right? Which kind of, it's a head scratcher in Western media. It's like every Ukrainian is a Nazi, even Zelensky. Zelensky's Jewish. And it's a weird thing that I don't think is given enough time to understand from the Russian point of view. And of course, Zelensky himself is not a Nazi, but neo-Nazism, anti-communism, this sense of extremist movements within Ukraine and Latvia and Lithuania and others that are being exploited and funded by the West as pro-democratic suddenly allows a number of alternative symbols and narratives to play out. And the fact that Ukraine and Latvia and Lithuania seem to be at the forefront in dismantling, destroying one Soviet monument memorial after another is indicative, of their disregard for history. The fact that they are spitting on the legacy and the memory of their fallen forefathers. But more than just the war, right? It's also this notion that the Soviet Union had a number of accomplishments, particularly in leading the charge with scientists and writers and artists and musicians and scholars and engineers and doctors. And yes, the Soviet Union is a relic of the past. And Putin has gone on record to say, right, the Soviet Union had its virtues and it had its vices. But we cannot and should not disregard the virtues while acknowledging the vices. So yes, the Soviet Union gave us Stalin and the gulags. It also gave us the Chernobyl disaster. The Soviet Union, according to Putin, was also rigid in its international outlook. It was hermetically sealed. It looked at the world as a threat and didn't want to engage the world in the same way that Putin is doing now diplomatically. And of course, playing into the religion and the traditional card, the Soviet Union was atheist, or at least officially atheist, which goes against a fundamental Russian value of Christianity. So of course, there is this internal debate within Russia today about the authenticity and the effectiveness of communism. Was it something that is part of Russia's tradition? Or is it really, you got to remember, communism is the writings of Marx. Marx is Western. It is not a Russian thing. Now, here is where things can get kind of really dicey, because some real Russian traditionalists, like before he died, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, among others, was saying that communism, Marxism, was an aberration of Russian history and development. Others will say, listen, it doesn't matter whether it comes from Marx or something else, it was our history. And so you don't see a dismantling of communist emblems or memorials in Russia because the history is now part of Russia's history. And look, let's be perfectly honest. If we go back to Putin's electoral demographics and say that the bulk of his supporters are 45 and up, the older you get, the more guaranteed his support is going to be. So his position on Victory Day, his emphasis of the narrative that Russia was on the right side of history in 1945, and the idea that the Soviet Union, for its problems, was at the forefront of human ingenuity, is basically a way for him to say to many people, it's perfectly fine for you to miss the Soviet Union, because you know what? I missed it as well. It was great, but it's in the past. We can learn from our mistakes from there, but we can also take the virtues of the Soviet Union, duty to fatherland, commitment to education, among two things, among others, and bring that into emulating into the Russian state, the Kazakh state, the Armenian state, the Belarusian state, the Ukrainian state, nonetheless. Right? And in this, right, someone like Putin subordinates himself to the state. It is in this sense that he, the top-heavy executive, assumes the role of someone who represents the present that is always remembering and grateful for what was sacrificed in the past. And so, his presence at memorial ceremonies, especially when it is now linking, right, the sacrifices made by fallen soldiers in the Soviet period with what is happening now in Ukraine, again, play it up however way that you want, is a way of providing a moral justification for what's being done, right? It is a way of showing that there is a noble deed. It's not just one country invading another and initiating regime change. If Putin wanted to do that, his initial plan which was effectively take Kiev as quickly as possible, decapitate the leadership, and then just install another Yanukovych-like leader in Ukraine. That kind of was brushed off aside for him to now go town by town, city by city in eastern Ukraine. The results have yet to, be seen here, but there is this sense that Russia is doing today in Ukraine what it was doing in the 1940s in denazifying it, right? In providing and keeping Ukraine's moral leverage, in history. So it's not a return to Soviet nostalgia so much as it is a hybridization of something new today. And this, I think, we can see really clearly in the mixing of both the Neo-Byzantine and the Soviets. The Russian church is now very much at the forefront of Russian political culture, right? This is something that Putin, among others, had said was a grave error with the Soviet Union, and that the church was subordinated, almost driven to the point of extinction, right, under Stalin. Today, right, the Russian patriarch, the Russian church, performs, as I've already said, an important responsibility. And so here we got a really good example of this, right? You have in the middle here the patriarch, Kirill, and to his left is the Russian Minister of Defense, General Sergei Shoigu. It's effectively patriarch and Byzantine strategos within this newly built church, the main cathedral of the Russian armed forces. It's, Hagia Sophia in size, but it's a hybridization of Soviet Russian historical memory that fuses Tsarist imperial Russia with the Soviet period and the present day, right? Fusing state, religion, and military, right, all together. And, the iconography in the church is clearly classical, right? It adheres back to a traditional, one would almost say it's a hybrid of both Paleologian as well as a turn of the previous century Russian artistic style. But it fuses, right, this sense of Russia's Christian heritage along with its military importance, right? In the sense that Russia has always been a country and a people that have defended itself from outside invaders, but have also done a job in defending other people from invasion, right? So you think about this for a moment here, and you're like, as far as Russia's concerned, the only time that they were invaded and conquered was the Golden Horde. Every other group, Napoleon, Hitler, everything else like that, right? They usually ended up in some catastrophic defeat, which usually is more to the weather than, military tactics. But this sense is very, very clear on what Russian soft power is. And it is an adherence to tradition, to history, to memory, but also to a classical tradition. So it's not avant-garde, it's not innovative in this sense. It is the idea that may exist within the Russian artistic sphere, but it is rooted, its foundations, right, are within a very, very clear set of models, principles, beliefs, and values that focus on, as I've said, faith, family, and fatherland. The final element of Russia's sovereign democratic soft power, and this one seems to resonate towards pretty much everyone else that is interested in this, is the notion of multipolarism. I've already said this repeatedly, right? Russia is the consummate international cooperator. It will work with any country that wants to work with Russia within full and unconditional acceptance of UN-led multipolarism. So there's something, you got to look in between the lines here, right? Russia has its own ideology, but it is not an ideology that it is going to project to the rest of the world like the Americans do, right? The Americans believe that any country that wants to deal with us, with the exception of Saudi Arabia and China because they're way too important, they have to adhere to some principles of liberal democracy, right? You got to engage in some kind of reform, modernization, cultural relativism. Russia doesn't care about that. What Russia cares about, at least as far as Russia's brochure says, is that keep your culture, do whatever you want, but work with us within the principles of UN-led legal multipolarism. Now, what about the United States? We'll work with the U.S. as well, says Russia. We have zero problems, we have zero grievances with the United States as the United States. But the United States needs to recognize that they are now working within a larger community of regional powers, one of which the U.S. is more than welcome and more than justified in being part of, right? And, the alternative to this is, of course, the European Union and the lesser known concept of the Washington Consensus, which is we have a policy of international organization and institution, but states that are part of that must give up an element of their sovereignty. They must give up some of their sovereign decision-making in order to be part of this group. The European Union is probably the best example of this. So you want to become a member of the EU, you have to harness and harmonize your foreign policy with that of the EU. You have to harness and harmonize your financial powers and your financial decisions with that of the ECB, the European Central Bank. So you can't conduct a foreign policy that is different from that of the European Union. You can't engage in economic agreements with any old country around the globe. You got to work with us first. So there is somewhat of a straitjacket that comes along with that, and this is something that adherents to sovereign democracy would say is a sign of weakness. And even within the European Union, you'll have people like Orban, Le Pen, to a lesser extent Jaroslav Kaczynski, but I'll stick with Orban in Hungary and Le Pen in France, while they were a member of the EU, certainly Nigel Farage of the UKIP party, all of them saying this is an obstacle. This is a restraint on the leadership and the decision-making of countries. And Russia's whole thing of multipolarism is like, hey, you don't even have to be a big power. You want to be a smaller power and come hang with us? Great. You know what? Keep your flag, keep your currency, keep your language, keep your culture. It's awesome. Right? You do you. And if you want to change, you do it on your own. We're not going to force you to do that, right? And I think that explains why these two got along so well. And, again, I don't want to make this into a political editorial, but it pissed the hell off of the liberal media establishment that these two allegedly got along as well as they did. I think Trump liked Putin more than Putin liked Trump. Trump looked at Putin as like a role model, someone that he wanted to be. Putin, I don't think really cared one way or the other about Donald Trump. But, this idea that Trump was Putin's puppet, that he was emulating him, this was horrible. I mean, one thing I will say, I'm no fan of Trump. I'm no fan of Donald Trump. I didn't vote for him, but I understand why he is as popular as he was and continues to be. But when he was running for office, I remember him saying something to the effect of, what's wrong with speaking to people like Vladimir Putin? What's wrong with mending fences and, finding common ground and moving forward? And, to people that weren't, within the liberal democratic beltway of Washington, or to people that, didn't subscribe to the New York Times or the Washington Post, this was considered normal. For people within that, this was anathema. This was horrible. This is America abrogating its liberal crusading mission to somebody that is hell-bent on, giving as many people a bad day as possible. But in effect, this is, brand Putin does have an effect on national populism, on national conservatism, and any real criticism of neoliberal economics, even among those on the left, right? When I say the left, I'm not talking about the Joe Biden, Barack Obama left. That's not left, and I'm not even talking about the Bernie Sanders left. The left has this weird relationship with Putin's leadership. It's not that they admire him in this way, but again, they understand. They get a sense of Putin, and more specifically, sovereign democracy, is capitalizing on the collective grievances, the limits, the shortcomings of neoliberal global order. And, we're getting to a point where Western hegemony in this sense has, come to an end. We have come to an end of history in the sense that, no, the world is going back to the way it was in the 19th century. And, you don't want to bring Trump into it. Take a look at, the new kids on the block here. Russia being a member of Brics, including India, China, South Africa, and Brazil, we're talking about not major economies right now, but emerging economies. Well, China is certainly a major economy. But to that, within the last few months, and here we're talking just, since May of this year, Argentina, Iran, Turkey, Mexico, and if I am not mistaken, Egypt and Saudi Arabia have all indicated some interest in joining Brics, which means we're going to have to call this thing something else because I can't imagine the acronym that we're going to use to this, right? But what's the allure, right? What is the allure? I mean, obviously, if you look at Saudi Arabia and Egypt, for one, they're not going to suddenly cut economic relations with the United States. But what this does in a multipolar system is that it gives them the opportunity to do what they want to do without having to feel like they have to conform to some set of norms and laws and procedures that the United States or the Washington Consensus expects you to do. Now, this adds a certain degree of nationalism to Russia, right? As being the one that is the leading country to stand up to the West, to stand up to this liberal hegemonic order. And yeah, of course, over the past couple of years, especially since the 2016 election, right, Russia has been targeted for being one that engages in interfering in other countries' elections. I think it's rather more than ironic that the United States gets upset for blaming Russia for something that only they feel that they can do, right? But, Russia is the occupant. Russia's the bad guy. Russia is the one that's preventing the West from achieving its alleged goals around the world. And, in a way, this feeds into a counter-narrative, a counter-nationalistic narrative within Russia that gives it a sense of pride. That, look, every place the U.S. has interfered in, not just in the Middle East, but, in former areas of the Soviet Union, the reality has gotten worse, right? Under Russia, it was great, allegedly. Afterwards, everything has just kind of, gone to hell. So before I conclude this lecture, right, I think that the best way of getting this point across is I want to share this video that's been on YouTube for a couple of years. And it's almost a way of Russia buying into its own negative stereotypes that was been given to it by the West and just saying, like, what are you going to do? Sort of come at me, bro. But I think it really gets the point across. So take a look.
Здравствуйте. Я русский оккупант. Это моя профессия. Так сложилось исторически. Когда-то я оккупировал Сибирь. Теперь там добывают нефть, газ, алюминий и еще много полезного. Теперь там города с детскими садами и больницами. Теперь там нельзя продавать женщин за вязанку соболиных шкурок, как это было до русских. Я оккупировал Прибалтику. Ее хутора я застроил заводами и электростанциями. Прибалтика делала высококлассную радиотехнику и автомобили, славилась духами и бальзамами. Меня попросили оттуда уйти. Теперь там добывают шпроты, а часть населения чистит унитазы в Европе. Я оккупировал Среднюю Азию. В голых степях я построил каналы, заводы, космодромы, больницы и стадионы. Там строили космические ракеты и самолеты, развивали промышленность, выращивали пшеницу и хлопок для всей страны. Меня попросили оттуда уйти. Теперь там развивают американские кредиты и выращивают коноплю. А часть населения уехала работать на стройки бывших оккупантов. Я оккупировал Украину. Вместе с украинцами я строил авиадвигатели, корабли, танки и автомобили. Меня попросили оттуда уйти. Теперь там разрушают все, что осталось от оккупанта. При этом там не строят ничего нового, кроме бесконечных майданов и диктатуры. Да, я оккупант, и я устал извиняться за это. Я оккупант по праву рождения. Я агрессор и кровожадный урод. Бойтесь. Это я терпел зверства польских интервентов во времена смуты. Но чем закончилась их интервенция? Это я сжег Москву, чтобы не отдать ее Наполеону. Но как закончил Наполеон? Это я сидел в окопе у Волоколамска, понимая, что нацистов удержать не получится. Где теперь те нацисты? Где их проклятый Гитлер? Ко мне мне домой приходили все, кому не лень. Турки, англичане, поляки, немцы, французы. Земли хватило на всех. По 2,5 метра на каждого. Поймите, мне не нужна ваша лицемерная свобода. Мне не нужна ваша гнилая демократия. Мне чуждо все, что вы называете западными ценностями. У меня другие интересы. Вежливо предупреждаю в последний раз. Не нарывайтесь. Я строю мир. Я люблю мир. Но воевать я умею лучше всех. С уважением, русский оккупант.
So to conclude, what has been a lot of information once again, and I try to move this along here and squeeze this in within a little more than an hour and a half. Russia's soft power balance sheet, as far as 2022, is that it now serves as a model for national conservatism, designed to address the political, economic, and institutional and cultural problems of the 1990s. Internally, Russia in the 1990s. Externally, the world in the 1990s, the globalized world of the 1990s, and the onset of neoliberal hegemony. It's not a counter-global ideology that will reverse that, but it simply is a way of providing an alternative, right? Another idea, a backup plan for emerging governments as well as conservative movements that are increasingly gaining electoral traction against the status quo that continues to push for neoliberalism. The second is that this is an official promotion of political, diplomatic, and cultural multipolarism, similar to the 19th century power alignments, but firmly embedded within international institutional principles. So whereas the realists will say, grab your history book because we are going back to the Realpolitik of the 19th century, that's not necessarily the case, right? Putin is not the next Bismarck, and let's be honest, nobody can be. But it's multipolarism within the acceptance of the primacy of the international institutionalism of the United Nations, first and foremost. In addition to that, Russia's activity within a multipolar cooperative framework is taking place, yes, at the bilateral level between one state or another, but also within other sovereign-heavy organizations like Shanghai Cooperative, the Eurasian Economic Union, the Commonwealth of Independent States, and the loosely defined organization of Brics. In other words, unlike the European Union, which is almost federal in mindset, but not entirely, but the government within Brussels has distinct overriding authority over its member states. Russia's concept of multipolar internationalism upholds, at least as far as the brochure says, upholds the principles of sovereign decision-making. So China, Kyrgyzstan, Belarus, and Russia's involvement in Shanghai cooperation means that all four of them, among others, make decisions as national leaders. There is no international body that coordinates and then dictates to everyone else. A third and final is that foreign policy, Russian foreign policy, may still very well then be based on models of defensive realism, right? If we kind of look at all of this as a way of blunting, reversing neoliberal global identity politics, it is in a way a defense mechanism, and realism is the best default for that, right? It is a way of safeguarding against threats to order, stability, and legal principles. But it's also one that is not global in its defense, right? Russia doesn't fear Iran or Turkey or China, for that matter, right? If Russia fears anything, it's the NGOs sponsoring the colored revolutions coming from the political and the academic circles of the West, right? So they fear Washington or Brussels or London, or to a lesser extent, Berlin for that matter. So they are really targeted against the specific and the perceived chaos of Atlanticist neoliberalism, right? Everything that we've been talking about, Russia's not safeguarding itself against the encroachment of Chinese philosophy, right? Or Indian culture, or Iranian music or Turkish food or something like that, right? Nobody ever worries about that. It's specifically coming from the so-called West. And I think in that sense, Russia has set itself up as being one of the leaders of the so-called rest of the world, right? West versus rest. This has been something that's been going on in writings and musings since the, late 80s, early 1990s. This is something I'm going to focus on next week when we talk about Russia and the rest, how Russia's soft power has been able to grow, especially in the last 5, or so years. But I think for now, that's enough. I think we've covered enough material. When you add to the first part of the lecture that we did, I think it's a couple of pages of notes that you all have taken. So, as I, mentioned in the previous lecture, right? Your comments, your thoughts, your opinions all matter to me. And especially those of you that are now taking this class in the name of public scholarship, please, by all means, put your thoughts and questions in the comment sections. Again, a little shout out to my Patreon page. Contributions and support are always welcome, and it helps wean me away from the organized dysfunctionality that is institutional academia. So if I can end up becoming a force of my own online, I'll be all the happier. Anyway, thank you all for listening this week. Anyone who wants copies of the reading that's not enrolled in my class, take a look at the links below. You'll be able to get some of them. Others that are behind academic paywalls, unfortunately, shoot me an email and I am more than happy to send you copies. All right, have a great week, everyone. I look forward to your comments, and I will see you next week when we look at Russia and the rest. Take care, everyone.